The first week of the climate change talks in Baku, Azerbaijan, has ended with a myriad of obstacles for the developing world. G77 nations rejected the draft text of the new collective quantified goal that stipulates a financing model that should have been fair for all. The Africa group of negotiators are, however, not relenting, even as some world leaders express doubt that the COP process will yield significant gains in the near future. Mashirima Kapombe is in Baku and now gives us an overview of week one at the Conference of Parties.
A cloud of doubt hangs above the Baku City Stadium, the meeting point of world leaders and climate change stakeholders. A scathing letter by former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, former UN Climate Change Chief Christina Figueres, and former Ireland President Mary Robinson painting a picture of despair on the COP process. The letter expressing disappointment on the COP's slow-moving processes in a climate crisis that waits for no man or nation. The Conference of Parties on Climate Change is in its 29th session, but a lack of cooperation amongst nations has stalled the much-needed progress required in reaching a climate finance agreement, achieving the 1.5 degrees centigrade goal and phasing out fossil fuels as stipulated in the Paris Agreement of 2015.
It's a gift of the God. Every natural resource, whether it's oil, gas, wind, sun, gold, silver, copper, all that are natural resources. And countries should not be blamed for having them and should not be blamed for bringing these resources to the market because the market needs them.
In our global economy, supply chain shocks raise costs everywhere. Decimated harvests push up food prices everywhere. Destroyed homes increase insurance premiums everywhere. And this is a story of avoidable injustice. The rich cause the problem, the poor pay the highest price.
The Africa group of negotiators expressing hope, but equally concerned that an agreement that is agreeable to all will be reached, as a third new collective quantified goal draft was presented Friday evening. But they are adamant that developing nations will not relent on their stand for a $1.3 trillion per year financing for climate change impacts. In a statement from the Africa group of negotiators, Ambassador Ali Mohammed said, and I quote, "We are not here to secure just any deal, but one that ensures the most vulnerable nations receive the support they need to cope with and mitigate climate change impacts. We need a deal that addresses finance, technology transfer, loss and damage, and ensures robust accountability for promises made." End of quote.
The one that was there earlier was very much imbalanced and did not take into consideration the issues of developing world and the issues of Africa.
We must reform the multilateral development banks to unlock financing at scale and to create incentives such as debt restructuring and sustainability, including the high cost of capital, borrowing, as well as scale and agility of climate finance.
The call comes in the wake of a second day of protests by civil society groups who want rich nations to pay for the damages caused by their actions over the years.
We need to set a goal, and a goal that is informed by the felt needs of our communities on the ground.
So as we go into week two, and we expect that our ministers will be able to take that on board, and we are going to brief them as soon as they resume the high level on week two of our concerns from the African group of negotiators.
And as a back and forth amongst nations continues, the COP takes a rest Sunday. And some are holding on to a glimmer of hope that an agreement will be reached at the last minute, as has been in previous sessions. But the impact of a last-minute resolution is what has left progress in limbo. Mashirima Kapombe, Citizen TV, Baku, Azerbaijan.
All right, and Mashirima sets the stage for a conversation tonight. As I've mentioned repeatedly, we are joined by Fred Njehu, who is a Pan-African political strategist for Greenpeace Africa. He joins us virtually from Baku, Azerbaijan. I also have in the studio Nicholas Abuya, who is a Global Program Resilience Advisor, Christian Aid. Good to have you gentlemen join me tonight. I'll start with you, Fred. How optimistic should we be for a deal where the developed developed world supports poorer countries as far as climate mitigation is concerned. Currently, the figure is $100 billion per year, but that was what was agreed to in 2009, extended by the Paris Agreement to 2025. So now economists are saying we now need at least $1 trillion. US dollars contributed by the developed world a year. But then you have Donald Trump saying that countries like China and the UAE, which were classified as developing countries then, which are not contributing, and they're saying, in fact, he said he will pull out of the Paris Agreement. How optimistic should we be of a deal being struck?
Thank you, Olive. Thank you, Olive, for that question and for having me this evening. There has been quite a lot of political posturing, and time is running out for the negotiators to actually strike a deal, going into the ministerial next week, where ministers will take over the negotiations. So the level of optimism is still low. There has been quite a lot of haggling between parties. Different proposals that have been brought on the table have not been agreed on. The text that we have is still very raw, and there's quite a number of thorny issues that needs to be ironed out. Countries haven't agreed on the contributor base. That's the countries that are supposed to provide the finances. But the Paris Agreement is quite clear, Article 9. You know, there is a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, where developed countries have an obligation to actually provide the finances to the developing countries. So the design of the goal is bringing quite a lot of contention, as well as the quantum. What amount do we need to see going into COP29 and to COP30? Finally, of course, on that issue is the geopolitics. The U.S. elections, the outcome. And a scenario where the U.S. is likely to pull out of the Paris Agreement, that certainly brings a lot of complexity, because the U.S. Congress has to take like a year to actually ensure that process, goes through. Yeah.
All right. And, we're just looking at pictures of who are in attendance. In our case, the Prime Cabinet Secretary, Musalia Mudavadi, represented Kenya. German's Chancellor did not attend, though he was expected to attend, Nick, because of what's happening with his government. And then we have not seen Joe Biden there. We have not seen Xi Jinping there. How optimistic should we be?
Well, thanks, Olive, for having me here. First of all, I would say that the presence of these politicians or head of states definitely would have sent a very strong political signal for the success of the COP29. So their absence definitely cast a dark shadow on that success. But definitely we can still remain optimistic that somewhat the negotiators who are at COP29 will have to reach a certain level of agreement, because a lot depends on this. Because when we look at how optimistic should we be, we put the question back that the success of this COP negotiation depends largely on the world prioritizing the needs of close to 4 billion people living in climate vulnerable countries, whose lives and livelihoods are at risk. So that's the bottom line, really. Yeah.
All right. Fred, what has been the effect of holding these talks in Azerbaijan? We had the president defend the fact that they're oil producers, saying they produce 0.something of how much is produced globally, and yet the countries that produce the largest amount of oil have brought issue with it being a petro country, quote unquote, a petro country. Has that proven a distraction?
Yeah, definitely. If you look at the ambition that countries had last year in Dubai, that is to phase out the fossil fuel and transition into renewable energy solutions, that of course places host country in a very big dilemma, in as much as the transition is supposed to take a bit of time. And also it brings on board a lot of corporate lobbyists from the fossil fuel industries who are largely responsible for the highest emissions, the greenhouse emissions. Over 80%, of the greenhouse emissions actually comes from the fossil fuel industries, and they bear the highest responsibility of providing a solution in terms of, paying for the damages and paying for the climate destruction. So the host country, has quite a lot of responsibility chairing this COP and going into the next COP. And that's what we are seeing in terms of having a petro state hosting the COP.
All right. Also, we have climate deniers. So Argentina, for instance, their president withdrew their delegation. And also, what would be the effect of, I think he's the first leader that Trump has met since he was elected. Donald Trump himself is a climate denier. What impact will that have on these negotiations?
Well, these are political shifts which have got a bearing on these negotiations. And we cannot really keep a blind eye to them. But having said that, people like Trump and the president of Argentina, we cannot allow them to hold the world at hostage. That's the reality. Even in the USA itself, we've got millions of citizens who really want the planet to be saved from climate change. Yeah, we have got corporates from the US, many, who are pro a greener world, So having said that, I would say that we are not going to tie saving the planet to what happens at White House. I think that's very important for us to be very clear about it, that we are going to forge ahead, regardless of the opinion of Trump and his ally from Argentina or whoever will again emerge, because we're in a political landscape, so that we save the planet and the people who live in it. Because we only have one planet and we have got a responsibility to protect it.
Do you agree, Fred? Because these are some of the largest emitters, and if there's no political commitment and he who pays the piper calls the tune, is it an exercise in futility? Fred?
Yeah, Nicholas is right, because if you look at the international community, the developed countries, the US, the EU, Japan, and other big countries, certainly they are the largest emitters. That's number one. They are highly responsible to provide the financing. And if you look at the way the financial architecture is designed, African countries just receive about 5% of the climate finance. That's quite very little. And much of it, or some of it, is actually, concessional loans that are quite expensive. And, look at the international interest rates, they are quite high, they are rising. But if you come back to the continent, the cost of adapting to climate crisis is quite high. Definitely, it's rising by the day. We are facing, extreme weather events that are linked to the climate change. So these countries cannot then come back and, block the negotiations and run away from the responsibility of providing the finances. The African group has placed a very ambitious proposal that's very grant-based public finance that, supposed to be split between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, which, in this case is supposed to be negotiated and placed as one of the key demands for the continent. So we still push the developed countries to bear that responsibility, but most importantly, to make those commitments that they had made since the Paris Agreement.
All right, we've had a number of eminent persons write an open letter to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as well as the UNFCCC. So, is it FCCC?
Yes, it's UN.
Okay, so they say essentially that the COP process, as currently structured, is not fit for purpose. It is not the first time they have said so. Yeah. What's your thinking, your response to that, Nick?
The COP process, Olive, has its own imperfections. That is admitted. But the COP process is the only vehicle that we have to hold the polluters accountable. So when I saw the letter that was written by those eminent persons circulating yesterday night, basically I saw it as an honest, constructive feedback to improve on the COP process, but not to disband the COP process. Therefore, to a large extent, I would say that it is kind of a misinterpretation of what they intended to do. That is my view. Because without the COP, the world was at a risk of a global warming of up to above 5 degrees Celsius. But in the last decade or so, that is not the case, particularly with the submitted NDCs, in as much as they may not be ambitious enough to achieve the Paris Agreement goal as it were currently. And you can also appreciate that over time, we are now hearing more about investment in renewable energy, something which was not there before. Yes, it is imperfect, but we have made strides. And what that letter intended to achieve, basically, from my interpretation, is to provide honest feedback for rebooting the process, for it to be more effective and efficient in terms of shifting from more of negotiation to implementation. Thank you.
All right, that is what they're calling for.
Yes.
And then they say some of that means moving away from negotiation to implementation. One of the issues they also bring up in that open letter is hosting these conferences in countries that produce oil. The other issue that has come up is that there are more fossil fuel lobbyists at this COP than many of the delegations, including those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Fred, what do you make of that?
Well, quite a lot of distractions in terms of the presence of corporate lobbyists. Of course, they are pushing for an investment goal. They are there to strike deals, to actually, slow down the process of the negotiations, put pressure on their countries. But, the multilateral process is an international UN process. And this is a very democratic space where countries, sit down and put their negotiation demands on the table. They assess their priorities based on the regional blocks they come from, and of course negotiate a deal that has to be agreed upon. So their presence there, it's quite an exercise in futility. But we can't ignore the fact that they have to be part of the just transition away from the fossil fuels into the renewable energy sources. And the point I wanted to make here around that is that, if they are paying for the damages that they have caused, then that's supposed to bridge, the financial needs and then bridging the gap that we're trying to address. But most importantly, making energy investments a priority. The African continent only receives about 2 to 3% of the total investments in energy globally. And that's why we have, 600 million on average, Africans without access to, to energy. That's a glaring statistic. And we have to look at how do we press for energy investments to meet the energy demands and the growing populations of the continent.
All right. So part of what happened with this COP is that they've approved standards for international carbon markets. And I'll get to you, Fred, on that. But there are those who argue, Nick, that this is a band-aid. Yes, it may provide financing to developing countries, but it does not, in essence, address the issue, which is global warming. Do you agree with those who hold that view, or do you think it all contributes?
Really, it depends on what kind of view you want to give it. I think what is there is that some of these are already embedded in the Paris Agreement, for example. And if they are embedded in the Paris Agreement, it therefore follows, for example, that if it is carbon trade, then we have to engage. Article 6 stipulates so, particularly paragraph 2 and paragraph 4. Paragraph 4, So there are pros and cons. Let me say so. Pitfalls are there as well. You get it? Because the argument is the global atmosphere is shared. So it doesn't matter where the carbon emissions happen or where the reduction happens. Yeah, it all contributes either to increasing or reducing it. Therefore, the question that comes in, if it can be done somewhere cheaply, for example, then why don't we do it there so that you achieve more? However, there are pitfalls, and these pitfalls, from a person like myself who come from a civil society, is what we want to address. Yeah, we are concerned about. For example, we have a binding goal on Paris Agreement as provided for in Article 2.1a, which states that every party, that's every country that is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, should make its own contribution to achieving the desired kind of global warming, or well below 2 degrees Celsius. So the implication of engaging in carbon trading is this. There's what they call corresponding adjustment. Is that if a country is buying carbon credits from, say, Kenya, for example, it means that there will be an adjustment on the Kenyan side, that whatever carbon they captured or sequestered or reduced, yeah, they subtract from the inventory. It is counted on the other country. It means that, therefore, collectively, at the end of the day, we are not contributing as desired to achieve that goal. However, having said that, when you look at it, there is also an argument which is ethical in nature, that we are allowing the polluters to continue polluting as long as they can pay for what they consider as very cheap carbon credits from developing countries, and therefore enhancing that unequal power relation that has existed between the polluters, which are the developed countries, and the least polluting countries, which are the developing countries like Kenya. So when you look at it from those perspectives, then you come to question that this is not morally correct, and it is not really contributing to that desired ambitious kind of mitigation to achieve the Paris Agreement goal.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, Fred, your proposal is a climate damages tax to be imposed on, for instance, those fossil fuel companies. Is that the position you hold?
Yeah, we've done calculations and found out that, imposing a carbon damages tax, raises about $900 billion US dollars up to 2030. Essentially, if you look at the design of the new collective and quantified goal, there are proposals there to actually introduce innovative sources of finance. And I must applaud Kenya is part of the Global Solidarity Levy. That's one of the solutions. France, Barbados, and Kenya, have brought in other countries into that arrangement where, they think around how do we raise revenues to tackle climate crisis, and how do we, build momentum for countries to joining into that coalition, essentially, and as a source of, innovative source of finance. It means that we are not going for, additional loans. If you look at the African continent, predominantly we are squeezed in terms of our debt crisis. And, the global markets where we're getting loans, it's becoming increasingly expensive. So how do we think outside the box and ensure that we raise the money that is required, and we don't put pressure on the macroeconomic stability of our countries, where we have, limited domestic resources, limited taxes to raise for climate action. So there are all these proposals on the table, certainly being supported by countries like the European Union and others. But of course, most of the developed countries are quite much against it, simply because, it's, they are the highest, industrialized countries, and they are supposed to pay those taxes.
All right, thank you for that contribution. I'll have to end the conversation therefore tonight, but we will pick it up on the hits and misses that come out of Baku. It continues to the 22nd of November, but we've had with us, joining us virtually from Baku, Azerbaijan, that is Fred Njehu, who is a Pan-African political strategist for Greenpeace Africa. I've also had in studio from Christian Aid, their global program resilience advisor, Nicholas Abuya. Thank you so very much, gentlemen, for joining me tonight. We take a break on Citizen Weekend, but coming up,